The last two quadrilaterals that we're going to be looking at are trapezoids and kites. The first quadrilateral, a trapezoid, has the least amount of characteristics of all the quadrilaterals that we've looked at, and its only characteristic is that it has only one set of parallel lines. So I'm going to mark that with my arrows. Notice, unlike a parallelogram, rhombus, rectangle, square, the second set of lines are not parallel. A specific type of trapezoid that we're going to be looking at is an isosceles trapezoid. So we still have our one set of parallel lines. So the set of parallel lines is called our bases. All right, the other two sides that they are referring to, so these are our base sides down here. The other two lines are called legs. The legs are going to be congruent to each other, so I'll mark that with a tick mark. And then both sets of base angles are going to be congruent to each other. So here is one set of base angles. And then here is our second set of base angles. So our base angles are the blue and the orange, and base angles are congruent to one another. Our last characteristic is that the diagonals are also congruent. So this would be a good time to take a picture. So we have diagonals are congruent. This would be a good time to take a picture to represent the characteristics of an isosceles trapezoid. So an isosceles trapezoid, or a trapezoid in general, has a mid-segment. A mid-segment is also parallel to the bases, but it cuts through exactly at the midpoint of the legs. So notice that they have the two tick marks to show that it is midpoint, and the other one tick marks to show that the midpoint does intersect halfway through each of the legs. Well, we can find the length of the midpoint. So if we know the length of both of the bases, we can find the length of the mid segment. So if my top length AB, or my top base, is 4 and my longer base is 10, I can find the length of the mid segment by finding the average. So I'm going to add 4 and 10 together, and once I take half of that, I will get the length of the mid segment. So 4 plus 10 is 14. Half of 14 is 7. So the length of my mid segment is 7. So same idea. I want to find the length of the mid segment. I know this is the mid segment because it's parallel to both of my bases, and it cuts through the legs at the midpoint. So I'm going to take my two bases, I add them together, and then I'm going to take half of that. So 12 plus 28 is 40. Half of 40 is 20. So my mid segment is 20 inches. The last quadrilateral that we're going to look at is kites. And if you notice, kites are a bit different. They have no parallel lines. It's the only special quadrilateral that we're looking at that doesn't have parallel lines. It does have two sets of congruent sides. However, they aren't opposite like all the other ones. So our longer lengths are equal to each other. Shorter lengths are equal to each other. There are only one set of congruent angles, and it's the included angle between the two different sides. So this angle is congruent to this angle. Those are the only two angles that are congruent. So if I labeled this properly, angle B and angle D are congruent angles. A and C are not congruent. And finally, our diagonals intersect at a perpendicular bisector. This is similar to a rhombus and a square. So So they cross at a perpendicular. And I shouldn't say bisector because A to the midpoint is not the same as M to the midpoint, or midpoint to C. So they just cross and they are perpendicular. So they form a 90-degree angle. So if I know two of my angles, I can find the missing angles. So if I look here, the top sides are congruent to each other and the bottom sides are included to each other. So my included angle is D and F. So that's my two angles that are equal to each other. So I know a quadrilateral, its interior sum is 360 degrees. So I am going to subtract 115 and 73 from 360. So 115 and 73 is a total of 188. And then I'm going to take 188 away from 360. To get a total of 172 degrees. So there's 172 degrees left between F and D. Well, since they are congruent, I'm going to divide that by 2. So 172 divided by 2 is 86. So each of these angles is 86 degrees.